y'all haven't really seen this bin. At least I don't think I posted it up. This is my breeder bin. This guy gets fed pretty much anything. The other bins for the greenhouse, that guy and the wigwam only get feed sources that are seed free. So this one is way easier to take care of. You just dump the food in there. It's like whatever. So what I'm doing right now is I just grabbed a 5-gallon bucket of worms because I have emergency breeder bins set up everywhere under mesquite trees throughout the farm. There's some over there hidden in amongst the canopy. So what I do is these worm bins are not maintained on a regular basis, so like I check in on them and I do the maintenance here and there. So like I checked in on these guys and there's not a lot of worms in them. I haven't really been putting food over there, haven't really been like jazzing it up for them. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna inoculate it with more worms. I'm gonna split this up into those 2 bins and give them a feeding and try to give them a little bit more attention so they stick around. Yeah, so I just spread my worms around in case of an emergency. I always have worms on hand. I haven't had to buy worms in like 8 years or something. The first thing I'm gonna do is take all this cardboard off, take the irrigation lines out. I'm gonna be digging a section out so that I can feed this worm bin. So when you're feeding a worm bin like this, you want to pick a spot to bury the food. This worm bin is not really thriving, so I'm going to feed it a little bit and inoculate it with worms. It's important to smash up the food because worms are like babies, they don't have teeth. I also like to bury the food. I don't like to put it on the top because that's when you get cockroaches and things that you don't want in your worm bin. So you want to bury the food, you don't want animals to be able to smell it. I put the irrigation lines back on and the cardboard on to maintain the moisture in this bin. So it should look something like this when you're done. Weigh it down with some rocks so that the cardboard doesn't go flying everywhere. So this is the same worm bin a couple weeks later. We're going to be checking on our worm bin, seeing where things are at. Can they handle more food? Are they breaking stuff down? And I'm going to dig adjacent to where I fed them last. So I'm moving where I'm burying the food with every feeding. So I'm getting the worms to go throughout the whole bin, eat all the worm bedding and all the material and make great worm castings. I really like using weeds as feed because they're mineral rich. They're accumulators of micronutrients, and when you feed it to the worms, they're gonna make that stuff bioavailable in the worm castings. So right here I'm using some dandelions, wild dandelion, and mallow. In permaculture, we call this chop and drop. And this is also stacking functions. Instead of just weeding these things and throwing them into a compost bin or into the trash, I am making quick work of them, feeding the worms. It's free food. It's right next door, right here on the ground. And it makes a lot of sense. So this is gonna mineralize my worm castings and it's going to give the worms a good, nutritious meal. Worms need a lot of nutrients to maintain their own health. So now we have all of our feed in there and we're gonna cover it up. I always like to bury the food in a worm bin, even if it's weeds like this. I noticed that there's some grubs in the worm casting, so I'm gonna pull them out and feed them to the chickens. This is a good time to kind of see what's going on with the worm bin when you're feeding them. Is there roaches? Is there crickets? If there is, you want to use some diatomaceous earth. This is a completely different worm bin. It's further along, and I'm feeding it about a 5-gallon bucket of food every couple weeks. Same thing, but a little bit bigger scale. I'm using a shovel, chop up the food, and bury it. That way I don't get roaches, rats. If I do notice to have roaches, crickets, or anything else that I don't want in there, I'm gonna throw some diatomaceous earth. If you see that you have some mice in there, maybe you need to put some mice traps around the worm bin. You can fix whatever is going on. This should be a clean process. It should not stink. I'm using pine needle mulch on the top as a cap to maintain the moisture. And there's a drip irrigation line in here that is on a timer. This is getting water consistently, which is really important for us in the desert. To be successful in raising worms here in our hot environment, there's a couple things you need to do. You need to put your worm bin, especially if it's going to be outside, you need to put your worm bin under a native edible tree, like a palo verde or a mesquite. Both of these trees will lose their leaves in the winter, and that will give your worm bin exposure to the sun in the winter. The other thing we need to think about is water. So I always set up these worm bins to drip irrigation that is on a set timer because I want that deep watering. Another thing to consider is the material itself. I'm going to primarily use wood, and I want it to be a minimum of 8 inches deep. These particular worm bins that you're looking at right now are a little too big in my opinion. I would redo them so that one person can lift them, because right now this is impossible to lift with many people. So moving on. The other thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you're giving your worms high quality feedings. You want a diversity of materials going into the bin, weeds, food scraps, compost.
Trying to inoculate the wigwam again.
So these are my breeder bins. Right here you're looking at the spot where we last buried a 5-gallon bucket of food, and the worms are just taking off. This is what you want to see the week after feeding them. And what I'm doing right now is I'm going to pull these worms out and inoculate other worm bins. Welcome to Wormania. This worm bin is almost done, and you can use your worm bins however you want. These worm bins in particular are set up to inoculate other worm bins with worms and to raise enough worms to give out to people for free, because this was in the community garden setting. So the main function of these worm bins was to support other community members trying to compost and create their own fertilizer, and also to produce worm castings for the greenhouse.
Over here. Feels so good to have the wigwam going again. These guys right here. I'll start with that. There's already worms in here. I just wanted to put a little bit more. Alright, so I pretty much emptied that bin into here. I transitioned the worms from here into there. So this is gonna be my main bin now. Pretty much I'm gonna add the bedding in the wheelbarrow. Let the worms eat through that bedding. That bedding is made of compost and coconut husk. So it's technically, the compost is technically food for them. But pretty much I'm gonna feed them a couple times. Cause I harvested, I split this bin and put a bunch of them in the wigwam to see if that would make a difference with the wigwam. So I'm gonna feed them a couple cycles, bring the population up, and then transition them again into that thing and do the whole process over. It takes about 3 months if I'm not haying it all the time. It can take as little as a month and a half if I'm using mushy material, things that they can go through really quick, like spent grain, compost, not whole chunks of stuff. Then it turns into 3 months if you're just throwing whole chunks of stuff.
So always alternate your feedings. Always excavate a good hole for your feedings and cover the food up. Smush the food really good as much as you can so that the worms can go through it really well. The amazing thing about this worm bin is I have a full-blown cherry tomato growing out of it, and it's producing cherry tomatoes, and they're super delicious. I just kind of left that area of the worm bin alone, and it grew and it produced fruit. It was pretty cool. So you can actually pull some of the volunteers out and grow them in your garden. It can be a little seedling starter station for you guys. Always remember to put your irrigation lines back in, make sure they're turned on, put some kind of cap on the top to keep the moisture in. It could be just mulch, you could use cardboard, moving boxes, junk mail, whatever.
Now I'm gonna add a top layer of compost and then cover it up with cardboard, and this guy gets fed maybe once a week, every 2 weeks, kind of like that, and they get a lot of different food sources, so the worms tend to take off in these bins, and these bins are more for breeding or the raising of worms versus the raising of compost. This stuff is good for composting. It's good for like throwing in your garden direct kind of thing, if you're down with the volunteers, I guess. So I'm gonna put this cardboard on here. Put some rocks on it. And that just helps with like the moisture. Keep it in there.